Welcome to Navigating the UX Maze, a webinar for people who are interested, or companies who are interested in adopting user experience design into the organization, or perhaps you've been trying to adopt user experience design into the organization and maybe it's not quite going as smoothly as you'd hoped. Today I'll be talking about a few things to keep in mind when you're trying to introduce user experience design into an organization. What are some tips and tricks to make it work better, be more efficient, more effective, and so forth. So we'll start with a little bit of how do UX designers look at the world like everybody else. There's different views and different types of experts in UX design. But like a lot of professions, they definitely do have their own language and ways of thinking about the world. You may recognize some of the terminologies like design thinking, user-centered design. You may have heard of certain different types of research like ethnographic research, contextual interviews, and so forth, information architecture if you're in the design side of things. And some of those may be familiar to you. Some of those may not. If you're a professional UX designer, all of those things would be very familiar to you, and you're comfortable with using them, and they mean something in quite a lot of depth. Now, the challenge, of course, is UX designers know a lot of these things in depth, but there are people from other parts of the organization who have other things that they think about and know about. So if you're in the product, if you're a product owner, or you're a business analyst or something like that, or you're one of the CMO or CEO, you think of things like monetization or the competition or market segmentation or various other aspects of how the business and how the product functions, and not as much about UX. UX is something that fits around these things that are important to the business or the product generally, if you're in one of those professions. And of course, there's other professions um, where the other key aspect, at least with people we generally deal with, are the technical experts. And those technical experts think about something um, not surprisingly, technical. So they talk about operating systems, they talk about SDKs, they think about networks and network elements and routers and APIs and all sorts of different things that might be of interest to them, um, depending on exactly what they're doing and what they're focusing on in the company. So the important thing is to realize, of course, there are these three different worlds and sometimes more within a company. But in order to get user experience design to work in the company, there has to be an aspect of understanding where the intersection between the business experts, the experience UX experts, and the technology experts lies. So how do you get that intersection that we've seen when companies work really well together, creating the magical, innovative, interesting products that serve their customers? Um, First part is I think really realizing what I just stated, which is you've got to recognize there are those differences and different ways of thinking about things. None of them are better than the other. They're all necessary in today's world to create a product that's usable, compelling experience on all those other, both cliches and truisms that you hear around products and user experience design. Um, One of the things that sometimes happens is in user experience design, I've been doing this for 25 years and I've given lots of presentations along the way where we like to explain our process and how it fits into the business process. And and I've started to come to believe that as much as we love our UX process, and eventually you've got to get to the point of how does the process all fit together, typically doesn't help if you're just adopting at first. So it can be kind of overwhelming if a company is just learning user experience design. If I'm in the technical side of things or if I'm in the product business side of things, I don't need to know everything about the process. I don't need to know all the details. I do need to know the gist of it. I do need to know how it fits in, but there's other things I'm more interested in. And of course, if you go all the way up to C-suite, they're interested in how do I achieve my business goals, and I really don't need to know the difference between formative and summative testing, and especially all the details in the process and how many people you select and things. So one of the first kind of tips I'd be aware of, it's not that we don't want to talk about process in UX, but if your tendency is to talk about that only, that may be something that's inhibiting introducing UX design into your organization. As much as it's useful to know, it isn't always as useful to talk about, especially at first. The other thing about UX process is that it's often about 1,000 different versions of that diagram I just showed you. So the bad news part of that last diagram is it's so different. The good news is whatever the process is, there's usually agreement on a number of things in UX design in terms of things you should do, regardless of whether you're running agile, waterfall, or something ancient like RUP at your organization. If you're introducing user experience design, there are things that are universally true that will help your organization and that you'll probably see as it gets adopted and adopted well. So organizations that are adopting user experience design in an effective way understand that user feedback matters. They understand that you should be creating and finding ways to integrate guidelines and patterns of design into the organization, especially if you have product lines and you want to repeat certain design patterns across products. They understand that design is never right out of the gate, that you have to build iteration into it. The other thing that's super important is UX design is not just done by UX designers. They're obviously critical, they have the expertise, but it really is a team activity because it is that intersection of circles. You're trading off against business and technical considerations all the time. It can be adopted in different processes and approaches, as I've mentioned. And it really isn't an all or nothing. You don't either do it right or you do it wrong. At first, you can just adopt aspects of it and improve the quality of the user experience design in your product that's going out the door, and eventually get to a stage of design that's much more sophisticated, but you don't have to start there. In fact, it's hard, like anything else, it's hard to start at the sophisticated level. You need to kind of walk before you run. And then, of course, what really matters is in however you approach it, what matters is the results. So give yourself lots of freedom for different opinions different than mine, and be clear on what you're trying to achieve, and not be driven by a kind of religious process, but an approach that works for your company, your end goals, and you can see it in the results of what your customers experience, and eventually in business metrics and how you're measuring success. One thing to keep in mind is that it really isn't something, even though there are one-day courses out there for user experience design, and those courses can be useful in the sense of they can introduce you to ideas. You cannot become a user experience designer or a researcher in a day or a week. We wouldn't expect that for someone, who's going from a completely different skill set to become a programmer in a day, because it's just not that easy. That doesn't mean you can't learn things, and it doesn't mean you can't apply things in your organization, but there's a danger in thinking, and this is particularly true for people it's brand new to thinking that you could learn a bunch of rules for user experience design and then effectively apply it to improve the designs of your products. One, a person can't learn that quickly. There's just too much knowledge to learn and too much experience that's required. Second, the organization has to learn as well. So it's not just about a person learning. You can't take a developer, even if he or she has a great aptitude for design, give them a course in a day, even if they were somehow the Mozart of design, the organization has to get there too anyways. So that last comment leads me to the idea of, even if you you got an exceptional designer in, or exceptional designers, it doesn't mean you're going to get exceptional design. And we've worked with companies and helped them where we've seen this issue. They've brought in a ton of exceptional designers, and they don't understand why they're not getting exceptional design out the door. And the reason is it's not just dependent on the skill of the people coming in, it's dependent on how easily the organization can adopt those skills and incorporate them in how do they design and build their software or products. And that ability to incorporate them or not, we've called UX maturity. So if you're a highly mature organization and you get a world-class designer, then right away they start contributing to superior UX design. However, if your organization's immature, they haven't adopted, and they may be super mature in other areas in their technology and their marketing and other things. This is just with UX. If they're immature, they're just learning what it is and how to adopt it, then they're not going to make use of that world-class designer in the same way because the organization isn't ready for it. So we've identified, and I won't go into them in detail, we've written white papers about this, given talks just about this one subject, but we've identified these 5 stages of maturity. It's really a continuum, of course, that organizations move through, where in stage 1, it really doesn't exist. They may just think UX design is visual design. They probably don't have a designer. They probably don't even talk about it. And it may be their business is doing fine without it. So they don't need to consider it that much. However, a lot of businesses, especially lately with consumer expectations finding their way into the business world, a lot of businesses are realizing that they need more sophisticated user experiences, better user experiences in order to be successful and create great customer experiences with their software products. So that jar, and sometimes they lost something to a competitor, or they've been compared to a competitor and unfavorably on their user experience design, jars them into an awareness of its importance. And during that awareness stage, they start to explore, maybe they bring in an expert, they listen to talks like this one or other talks, they start to explore user experience design. Typical action a company might take is just hire one user experience designer and hope they're going to fix everything, which doesn't work. Doesn't mean it can't be a step in the right direction, but it doesn't work. And it's not that they don't realize it because they're not bright people. They don't realize it because they just don't know as an organization that much about how user experience design works. After stage 2, during this awareness stage, there's still the realization they're struggling. They move into a stage 3 if they realize that struggling has led them to the fact that, okay, we need to do more. And they start to bring in more expertise. They take it a little bit more seriously. Often there's somebody in the company, maybe it's a CMO or a VP, who's starting to drive it for a certain product or product line. They start to adopt and start to do at least some specific projects that have clear user experience goals. They've got a team integrated into their team, and they've adopted some of the practices. They probably haven't adopted all of the end-to-end sophisticated practices user experience design has, but they've adopted some of them. And then once that's successful, and this is the hardest stage to move through typically, then it kind of goes through the entire organization where most projects, most activities are being done with user experience design in mind. People are aware of it, educated, and so forth. And eventually, it's in the 5th stage, it's so in the DNA, people almost don't even think about it. It just happens as naturally as you know, scrums happen in companies that have adopted Agile, that people couldn't imagine not adopting it. So those are the different stages, and really some of the tips and tricks here are about that stage 2 and 3. How do you move through those stages? So quick quiz on that, things to ask yourself to kind of go, well, how do I know what stage I'm in besides those general discussions. So here's some questions you can ask yourself. Do you have a director or VP of UX design? So do you have somebody with some authority, clout, and so forth, with a specialized expertise and background in UX design that can influence the organization? It's usually reflective that the organization is taking it seriously if they have someone in this position. If they don't, the organization is not taking it seriously, and you're just not going to get as good results. Do you have people specifically trained in user experience design? So if people have taken that one-day course or read about it, and that's all they're doing, then you don't have specific training. You've got some interest and you've started it, but you're never going to get past through those stage 2 and 3 without the people specifically trained, and typically the first one too, the director or VP. When does UX start really? And if you think UX design starts the minute people start coding and you say that's because it's agile and so forth, that probably means you're not doing it to the level of sophistication again to get through that stage 2 and 3. It's not that you have to throw away agile, but there are lots of things that start before sprints, right? Just like business analysts are doing things before you do a sprint, UX experts should be involved in that before a sprint. Is it integrated all into your software design development processes? So if you think it's something separate, and this is probably more a stage 2 thing or stage 1 thing, you haven't even thought of it as a process, you think you just kind of layer it on at the end, and that's a sign there's a long way to go in getting it successfully out the door. And this is a more question to ask yourself: if the other ones are in place, then you're probably doing quite a lot successfully. The question to ask yourself: are you doing it consistently? Because that's moving out of stage 3 into stage 4. If you've got these experts, if you've got it in the process, if you do it before you start coding, then the question is: are you doing that on all the products that you should? In which case, if that's the answer, you're really moving out of the stage 2, stage 3 into stage 4, maybe even stage 5. And a simple one to just ask yourself if that's tough to, I'm not sure what all those things mean. One of the things just ask yourself is stand back and go, what do you do? Do you do usability? Even forget about whether I'm in stage 2 or stage 3. Do you do usability testing? Do you have design reviews? Do you do ethnographic research? Can you actually name specific UX activities, or do they just happen implicitly? And if they're just happening implicitly, then again, you're in one of those earlier stages. If you can list a whole bunch and they're done by experts, then you're probably more sophisticated in UX design. As I mentioned, a lot of organizations we see at least are in the stage 2 and 3, and this is, I think, partly a market thing as it's become a necessity. Organizations that were successful without much formal UX design are now aware that they should have it and or adopting it. And depending on the size and scope and nature of the organization, that can take quite a while, even with well-led organizations. It's not about the leadership or the skills of the people. It's just adopting any change can take time. So how do you progress? So what are some things, if you're in the stage 2 or stage 3 and you feel kind of stuck, what are some things maybe you want to look at for it, or actually actionable coming out of this talk? You could go back and say, hey, we could do this. This will kickstart us through or move us through those stages a bit. One, you either have or look for or try and get executive champions. So because executives have money, as these two little fellas do, and they can influence change. You need to any change within an organization needs investment of money and or time. And executives typically have, within any organization, the ability to allocate one or the other. So executive champions are super important. And sometimes there are people who are fantastic influencers, you can look to them, and often what they do is they influence the executives. So, but that's really a necessity to get through those awareness adopting changes. Without time and money being spent, it's just not going to happen, no matter how great the people you bring in are. One thing that we recommend when people are just adopting this is don't try and adopt it through the entire organization first, even though it's a great end goal and you want it in the organization. It's a classic, don't bite off more than you can chew. Pick one project that's got that executive backing, that needs UX, and that people are willing to invest some time and expertise in. Get that to work, demonstrate to the rest of the organization the value of it, and then people adopt things that are valuable. The other thing is, big fan of, and this is different for different organizations, but pick stuff that's an easier fit. Sometimes it's very hard for, say, an agile, technically focused organization to adopt something like ethnographic research, even though it's super valuable, because they just don't know how to absorb it into their project process. So things like usability testing or walkthroughs, though, can be integrated almost into any process. So pick an activity that shows value, try it out, you get a foothold, you show the value of it, and people say, wow, this is great. And then you can go back to them and say, well, you like that, here's some other great activities you can do in UX. Another really easy one, super easy one, is when you do design reviews, because almost every organization, even whatever their sophistication is, does some sort of design review, right? Whether it's reviewing the workflows or the screens. And a great way to just learn the idea of iteration and getting feedback is to recognize that you can sketch, and sketching can be done literally by hand, or some people are super fast with something like balsamic. Do these design reviews because they're, again, easily incorporated generally into any process. They don't require a very specific process or process change. They can be introduced, and people see the value of them quite quickly because the sketches will change because you're all getting different feedback and thinking about different things. Another relatively easy one, although it's hard to get these quote right without data and research, but even the idea of introducing personas can be very powerful. Personas are essentially archetypes, a kind of conglomeration of information about your users into little packages of fictional people, but fictional people who have characteristics representative of the characteristics of your target market. So you talk about their motivations, their context, their skills, and a bunch of other things. These are easy to look up online. And they're a super effective tool, again, just for getting organizations thinking differently, thinking externally about their users rather than internally thinking about how would I use it, which is the default way people think about software often if they're not doing something more formal. So a persona is relatively easy to introduce into an organization. So if you're just in that awareness stage, that's a great one to introduce. Usage scenarios are similar. They're essentially use cases with context. So instead of saying, the phone must be able to make a phone call, you talk about one of those personas and the context of which someone might want to make a phone call or buy something online. So it's not just about going through the steps of buying something online. You create a scenario like someone has to buy something online for their nephew really fast because they're late for their birthday or something. And all this contextual description around a task or an end goal adds a color and insight into the design that you don't get if you just describe something like a use case. You bring the people alive. And again, this is a great one that people can start to do. Even it's better with data, of course, but even without data, just to get the idea of thinking about the user rather than just thinking about the functionality. Um, Another great thing to do that you can take away and just start doing, and one of, in a way, the easiest, again, not easy to do well necessarily, but easy to just do at least to get people thinking in a different way, is to kick off projects, or at least the design portion of projects, with workshops, collections of those business, technical, and design people in a room to work together on some initial design ideas. So the value of that is the fact that you get all these different people in a room discussing, getting alignment, working through what the technical and business considerations are, as well as the design considerations. It's not about solving everything, because you're not going to solve everything in a day or a day and a half, whatever you do for this workshop. But you will start to look at design as an integrated team activity, and that makes a huge difference to how organizations change. So again, these are all different starting points. If you're kind of stuck in this awareness or adoption phase where you're not sure how to keep going, this is something to kind of unstick people, these different activities. And then as you're being successful, if you do these things right, you will be successful. You need to be sharing and essentially selling internally, but not in a a way that's underhanded anyway. It's just straightforward by sharing what you've learned with the company, but it is a type of selling. You're showing to other people on the team, outside the team, the value of what you've done through these different activities. One question I get from people, I hear a lot of different views on this. Should you do design workshops, and should you do personas, and should you do usage scenarios if you're not doing it right? So if you don't have an expert doing a persona, or the persona is not based on data, is it worth doing? And my my view is it's very dependent on the organization, what you're trying to accomplish. I do believe it's worth trying some of those things, even if you don't have experts doing it. So for instance, the design kickoff, if you're not going to invest in an expert, if you've made that decision, then, and you still want to do something, I would still try this stuff. The caveat around that is you're not, if you're trying to set the UX design bar high, if it's really key to your business goals, then you need expertise. It's just like anything else. If your technical sophistication needs to be high to be successful in your business, then you hire technical experts. There's just no other way around it. And different domains hire different expertise in order to get to certain levels. So if you have a low bar in UX design, or you just want to explore it, I think it's still worth doing, but your expectations should be, when it gets out to the market, don't expect it to knock people's socks off, because like anything else, it requires time and expertise. But I still think it's worth trying, and sometimes what it does is help people with the appreciation of how difficult it is. Sometimes it doesn't, because you don't see what you're doing incorrectly, just like other areas of expertise. So really a personal thing, but I don't think it's a binary. I don't think it's, you either don't do it or you do it right. I think there's different companies in different contexts. So final thoughts, if you want to, what do you take away from this? Because no one ever remembers the whole thing. It's worth going back and asking some of those questions I put out, and just get a general sense. Hey, are we a kind of stage 2, stage 3 company where we're aware of it or just starting to adopt it? And then think about what you're going to invest time-wise in terms of what could you start doing. Look at those, could you start doing personas, usability testing, and so forth. And if you're really serious about doing this, don't just do the activities, do them right by getting someone who's an expert involved, whether it's hiring or contracting out or whatever. If you're going to set the bar high and you really want to advance the organization, If you want to advance it quickly, I don't think you can count on training because you can't. It just takes too long. It takes, to be an expert, it takes years. Um, if you're not in that much of a hurry, then of course training is the third option besides hiring and getting outside help. Um, that's it. I hope this was useful. And again, thank you very much.